The room was dark except for the faint glow of a lantern swinging gently in the corner, casting long, flickering shadows on the stone walls. Elias sat at a worn wooden table, his fingers absently tracing the grooves etched into its surface. His once steady hands now trembled slightly, the weight of age and guilt having caught up with him. Decades had passed since that fateful night, but the memories of his greatest crime haunted him still, sharper and more unforgiving than ever. He was once known as the best, the master thief of his time. There wasn't a lock he couldn't pick, a vault he couldn't breach, or a noble house he couldn't slip into undetected. Elias had built a reputation among criminals as an artist of his craft, and his exploits were whispered about in taverns and back alleys throughout the kingdom. Yet it wasn't the thrill of gold or jewels that drove him. It was something deeper, darker, a need to prove himself in a world that had discarded him. But the night he broke into the house of Lord Atherton, everything changed. It was supposed to be his final job, the one that would allow him to retire with enough wealth to escape his sordid life. Atherton's mansion was legendary, a symbol of wealth and power in the kingdom, and rumors swirled about the treasures hidden within its walls. The job was dangerous, but Elias wasn't a man who shied away from risk. He had planned every detail meticulously. The guards' shifts, the layout of the house, and the hidden passages that would allow him to slip in and out undetected. The heist went almost perfectly. Almost. Under the cover of darkness, Elias had crept through the mansion's halls, his heart pounding in his chest as he neared the vault. The prize, a set of priceless heirlooms, was within reach, and for a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life free from the shadows. As his fingers expertly picked the lock on the vault door, he was startled by a noise behind him. He spun around, dagger in hand, only to find a young girl standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, dressed in a fine nightgown that shimmered in the dim light. Elias froze, his heart hammering in his chest. In all his years as a thief, he had never harmed anyone. His rules were simple: steal from the rich but never shed blood. But this girl, this innocent child, was not supposed to be here. For a moment their eyes locked. The girl opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, Elias darted forward, covering her mouth with his gloved hand. His pulse raced as he whispered, "Please, don't scream. I won't hurt you. Promise." The girl trembled beneath his grasp, her wide eyes filled with fear. Elias could feel her rapid heartbeat against his hand, and guilt clawed at his chest. He knew he should have fled then and there, but something held him back. He couldn't leave, not without the treasure. With one final look at the girl, he bound her wrists with a silken cord from the curtains and gently placed her in a chair by the fireplace. "I'll be gone soon," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "I'll be gone, and you'll never see me again." He turned back to the vault, his hands shaking as he completed the job. The heirlooms, glittering gems, ancient crowns, and the Atherton family crest, were more magnificent than he'd imagined. Elias stuffed them into his sack, his mind screaming at him to leave, to run before things spiraled further out of control. But as he made his escape, he cast one last glance at the girl, and something in her eyes, something innocent, something pleading, seared into his soul. That was the last time he'd ever stolen anything. Elias disappeared into the shadows, slipping through the streets and vanishing into the night as if he had never existed. But the guilt followed him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much time passed, the memory of that terrified girl haunted him. It was more than the theft itself. It was the knowledge that he had taken something from that family that could never be replaced. A sense of security, trust, innocence. He had shattered their world, and he couldn't forgive himself for it. The years passed, and Elias tried to forget, but the nightmares never ceased. In his dreams, he would return to the mansion, only to find the girl waiting for him, her eyes accusing and filled with pain. He became a shadow of the man he once was, retreating into a life of isolation. The treasure he had stolen brought him no comfort, no peace. It was nothing more than a reminder of his greatest sin, a burden he carried in his heart and his soul. Now, nearly 30 years later, Elias found himself standing outside the gates of the Atherton estate once more. He had aged. His once strong body now stooped with the weight of time, his hair graying at the temples, but his resolve had never been clearer. The guilt that had plagued him for decades could no longer be ignored. He needed to make amends, to face the family he had wronged so long ago, even if it cost him everything. The estate had changed. The grand mansion that had once stood as a beacon of wealth now looked worn, as though the years had taken a toll on its grandeur. The gardens were overgrown, and the once proud stone walls were chipped and faded. Elias felt a pang of sorrow as he approached the front door, unsure of what he would find inside. He knocked, his heart pounding as he waited for someone to answer. Minutes passed, and just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair and a frail frame. Her eyes, though clouded with age, still held the same sharpness that Elias remembered. Elias faltered, his throat dry. "I've come to see Lord Atherton." The woman's face tightened, and for a moment, Elias feared she might recognize him. But then her expression softened into one of deep sadness. "There is no Lord Atherton anymore," she said quietly. "He passed many years ago, not long after the incident." Elias felt the weight of her words like a dagger to his heart. The incident, his theft. Lord Atherton was dead, and it was his fault. He had ruined not just a family's fortune but had broken a man's spirit. "And the rest of the family?" Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman sighed deeply. "The daughter, Lady Eliza. She still lives here. But she is not the girl she once was. Her father's death changed her. She lost much that night." Elias's heart clenched. The girl, the one he had tied up, the one whose life he had destroyed, was still here. But she was no longer the innocent child he had encountered in that room. She had grown, and the shadow of his crime had followed her through the years. "Please," Elias said, his voice trembling with desperation. "I need to see her. I need to make things right." The woman hesitated for a long moment, studying his face as though she could sense the weight of his guilt. Finally, she nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The house was quiet, its once grand halls now echoing with the silence of loss. Elias followed the woman through the corridors, each step heavier than the last, until they reached a large room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the woman gestured for him to enter. Inside, Eliza Atherton sat by the window, her face pale and drawn. Her hair, once golden and full of life, was streaked with gray, and her eyes, the same eyes Elias had seen all those years ago, were haunted by memories too painful to speak of. She turned as he entered, her gaze locking onto him with an intensity that made his heart ache. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with the weight of unspoken words, of years of guilt and sorrow. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. "You," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet bitterness. "I always wondered if you would come back." Elias swallowed hard, his chest tight with regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I've come to make amends, to right the wrong I did to you and your family." Eliza's eyes narrowed, and she stood slowly, her movements graceful despite the years that had passed. "Make amends? Do you think that's possible? Do you have any idea what you took from us that night?" Elias's heart shattered. He had thought about it for years, but hearing it from her, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it all the more real. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try. Please, tell me how." Eliza's gaze softened, though the pain remained. She stepped closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You took more than just money and heirlooms. My father, he was never the same after that night. He lost everything, the wealth, the respect, the trust. It broke him, and when he died, the weight of his grief fell on me. You ruined us." Elias felt the weight of her words like a crushing blow, his knees trembling beneath him. He had known, deep down, that his actions had consequences. Elias fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this. I can't bring him back. But please let me do something. Anything to help you now." Eliza looked down at him, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice softer. "It's too late for my father. But it's not too late for you." She reached out a hand, helping Elias to his feet. "If you truly want redemption, you'll live with the consequences of your actions. Help rebuild what was lost. But know this, no amount of gold will ever make up for what's gone." Elias nodded, understanding that redemption wasn't a single act, but a lifelong journey. He would carry the weight of his guilt forever, but in that moment he took the first step toward making amends, knowing it was the only way forward.